Nancy Guthrie didn't vanish in a way that makes sense to anyone afterward. There was no dramatic argument overheard by neighbors, no screaming in the night, no shattered glass on the kitchen floor. No single moment where someone stopped and thought to themselves, something is deeply, terribly wrong here. She simply slipped away from the edges of the world that had held her, leaving behind all the ordinary details of a life that looked, from the outside, completely unremarkable. And that's the part that lingers, isn't it? Not the absence alone, but how quietly it arrived, how little warning there was. How a woman can disappear from the story of her own life and the world just keeps turning like nothing happened. The coffee grows cold in the cup she left behind. The mail keeps coming. And the people who knew her begin to wonder, slowly and painfully, if they ever truly knew her at all. For a long time, the name Nancy Guthrie existed mostly on the edges of public awareness. It was spoken in small circles, kept alive in the memories of investigators and family members who simply refused to stop looking, refused to accept that a person could just disappear without a trace. There were questions from the very beginning, the kind that don't go away no matter how much time passes. Inconsistencies that wouldn't resolve themselves, no matter how many times anyone tried to rearrange them or make sense of them. And then, eventually, came the discovery. Not far from where she was last known to be, remains were found, and with those remains came something even heavier than grief: new questions. Questions that tore open wounds people had spent years learning to carry, learning to live around. Questions that now have investigators revisiting everything from the very beginning. Because in a case like this, a discovery doesn't always bring answers. Sometimes it only confirms what people had quietly feared all along. That the story goes much deeper than anyone had ever allowed themselves to believe. There is a particular kind of grief that settles over a community when someone disappears without explanation. It's not the clean, devastating grief of confirmed loss, the kind where you know and you can finally begin to mourn. It's something murkier. Something that asks you to hold two impossible things at once: the hope that a person is still out there somewhere, living some other life you can't imagine, and the quiet, terrifying sense that something may have gone irreversibly wrong. That is the grief that has surrounded the Nancy Guthrie case for as long as people have been following it. A woman, a life. A disappearance that never resolved itself into anything the people who loved her could understand or accept. It just sat there, year after year, as an open wound that never quite healed over. Nancy Guthrie was not a name that splashed across national headlines the way some missing persons cases do. She never became the subject of breathless cable news coverage or viral social media campaigns in those early days when it might have made a difference. She was, in many ways, the kind of person who gets missed quietly, mourned in church pews and at kitchen tables, whispered about at community gatherings, kept alive in the prayers of the people who knew her best. And yet her case has always carried a specific weight to it, a strange, persistent heaviness that simply refuses to lift. Those who have followed it closely, investigators who worked it, journalists who covered it, advocates for the missing, they all speak about it in a particular tone: careful, measured. Like people who sense that the full truth of what happened has never fully surfaced, like they're waiting for something they can't quite name. What is known is this: Nancy disappeared under circumstances that raised serious questions from the very beginning. The details surrounding her last known movements were never entirely clear, no matter how many times investigators went over them. The timeline had gaps that couldn't be filled. The accounts that emerged in the weeks and months following her disappearance did not always align neatly with one another. And sometimes they seemed to contradict each other in ways that only deepened the mystery. And despite all the years that have passed, the case never arrived at the kind of resolution that would allow the people who cared about her to set it down and finally breathe. In communities touched by cases like this one, life goes on, but it goes on differently. People look at familiar places with unfamiliar eyes. They replay conversations they didn't know would be the last ones. They carry the weight of not knowing in the quietest, most invisible way possible. That is the world this story lives in. A world of incomplete answers, of partial truths, of a woman who deserved so much more than the silence that followed her name. And now, according to reports, something has changed. Before any of this, before the disappearance, before the search, before the long years of unanswered questions, there was simply a woman living a life. Nancy Guthrie was, by most accounts, a person deeply embedded in the fabric of her everyday world. She had connections. She had routines. She had the kind of existence that appeared, from the outside, grounded and real and ordinary in all the ways that matter. The people who knew her described someone who was genuinely present in conversations, in relationships, in the lives of those around her. Someone who showed up. Someone who was easy to remember, easy to love, easy to imagine growing old with. That matters more than it might first seem. Because when investigators work backwards through a disappearance, they are not simply trying to understand what happened in the final hours. They are trying to understand the full shape of a person's life, the relationships, the patterns. The quiet places where the fabric of a normal existence might have begun to fray without anyone noticing. In Nancy's case, the picture that emerged in the early stages of the investigation was not a simple one. There were layers. There were aspects of her circumstances that required careful attention. People around her had observed things, small things perhaps, that in retrospect felt significant. Though at the time they may have seemed like nothing more than the ordinary friction of everyday life. This is almost always how it is. The moments that turn out to matter most are never flagged in real time. They are only recognized in the rearview mirror, when the people who witnessed them are sitting across from investigators trying to reconstruct something they never imagined they'd need to remember. What made Nancy's case particularly difficult from the beginning was the absence of a clear, decisive moment. There was no single event anyone could point to and say, here, this is where everything changed. Instead, there was a series of impressions. A gradual accumulation of details that, taken together, suggested something had gone wrong but never quite told the whole story. She had a life that looked stable. She had people who cared about her, and then one day she was gone. The world she left behind had no map for what came next, no instruction manual for how to keep living when someone you love just disappears into thin air. When Nancy Guthrie was first reported missing, the initial response moved through the familiar stages. Reports were filed. Inquiries were made. The people closest to her were contacted and asked to share what they knew. But almost immediately, according to those familiar with the early days of the investigation, something felt different about this case. The details didn't settle the way they were supposed to. The narrative that emerged was not clean. Pieces of the timeline, when laid side by side, left spaces that couldn't be filled with any explanation that truly satisfied. Search efforts were mounted. The areas around her last known location were gone through carefully and thoroughly, inch by inch. People who loved her organized and coordinated, and refused to accept that the absence of answers meant there were no answers to be found. That kind of persistence, that refusal to let someone disappear quietly, is one of the most profoundly human things there is. It is painful and exhausting, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, it leads nowhere. But it has always mattered. It will always matter. In the weeks and months that followed Nancy's disappearance, investigators were reportedly pursuing multiple threads. There were individuals whose accounts raised questions, whose stories seemed to shift in ways that drew attention. There were circumstances surrounding her last known days that, according to reports, drew significant scrutiny from those working the case. No arrests were made. No official conclusions were publicly reached. The investigation, as far as the public was aware, continued without resolution. This is the phase in a missing persons case that the public rarely sees clearly, the long, grinding middle. The months where investigators are working and the family is waiting and the community is watching and nothing seems to move. Until one day, without warning, something does. For the people closest to Nancy, those months became years, and those years were a particular kind of agony. Waiting for news that never came. Holding on to hope that grew harder to sustain with each passing week, each passing birthday, each passing holiday where an empty chair sat at the table. Living inside a question that had no visible answer and no visible end. And then, the ground itself began to offer up what had been hidden. The discovery of remains near the area associated with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was not a moment of immediate relief. It was, according to those who follow this case closely, something far more complicated than that. When remains are found in connection with a long-standing missing persons case, there is always this terrible pause that falls over everyone involved. Because the discovery confirms that something irreversible happened while simultaneously opening an entirely new chapter of questions. Questions about how, questions about when. Questions about what those remains reveal about the circumstances that led to that place, in that ground, without anyone knowing for all those years. Investigators, according to reports, were called to the scene. Forensic work was undertaken. The careful, painstaking process of examination that characterizes serious investigations was set into motion. Official statements were measured and precise, as they should be at this stage, when speculation can damage both the integrity of an investigation and the dignity of the people at its center. What made this discovery particularly significant and particularly unsettling was its proximity. The remains, according to available reports, were found not far from locations already connected to the case, which raises a question that now sits at the heart of everything investigators are reportedly revisiting. How close were they to this all along? How many times did someone pass within reach of the truth without knowing it? That question is not just investigative. It is deeply, achingly human. It speaks to the nature of what goes hidden and what eventually gets found, and the strange, random cruelty of proximity. The fact that the answer to a question haunting a family for years may have been, in some quiet and terrible sense, nearby the entire time. For the people who loved Nancy, news of the discovery brought forward emotions that are genuinely difficult to describe. Grief, certainly, and some measure of grim recognition. But beneath both of those, the renewed, urgent need for answers that had never really gone away. It had only grown quieter with time, like a radio signal that fades but never fully disappears. And now it was broadcasting again at full volume. There is something about unresolved cases that changes the people who carry them. Investigators who have spent years working a case without resolution describe a particular mental state, one where the open file never fully closes, even after they've moved on to other work. Where the face of a missing person stays in a corner of the mind long after the official hours of the day have ended. The Nancy Guthrie case appears to be one of those. A case where the questions embedded themselves deeply into the people who pursued them, refusing to let go even when all the leads had run cold. What those questions centered on, according to reports and those familiar with the investigation, was not simply the matter of her disappearance, but the specific circumstances surrounding it. Details that pointed in directions requiring careful, serious examination. Throughout the history of this case, there were reportedly individuals whose accounts shifted over time. There were elements of the timeline that investigators found difficult to reconcile with each other. There was the persistent sense, among those working closest to it, that the surface of what was publicly known did not fully reflect the depth of what had actually occurred. No official conclusions were reached publicly. No charges were filed that resolved the core questions of what happened to Nancy and why. And in that space, the space between what was suspected and what could be proven, the case lived for years, unresolved, carrying within it the weight of a truth that had not yet found its way out. The discovery of remains changes the forensic landscape of a case like this in ways that are hard to overstate. Physical evidence that was previously unavailable becomes available. Scientific analysis that could not be performed can now begin. Pathways that seemed permanently closed may now reopen. According to investigators familiar with how these developments affect active cases, even partial forensic evidence can provide answers to questions that have been sitting open for years. What those answers might reveal in Nancy's case is something that investigators and the people who love her are now, carefully and painstakingly, waiting to learn. Some who have followed this case have spoken about the layered nature of grief when a case reopens like this. You think you have found a way to live with not knowing. You build a life around the empty space. And then something changes, and all of it rushes back at once, sharper and more urgent than before, because suddenly it feels like knowing might actually be possible. There is a particular complexity that accumulates around long-standing cases, especially ones that have carried the kind of questions surrounding the Nancy Guthrie investigation. The longer a case remains unresolved, the more layers form around it. Memories shift, people's accounts evolve, new relationships between details emerge that weren't visible earlier. And the emotional weight carried by everyone touched by the case deepens, in ways that are difficult to articulate and almost impossible to reverse. According to those familiar with the investigation, there are aspects of Nancy's case that have consistently drawn more attention than others. The circumstances immediately surrounding her disappearance, the nature of certain relationships in her life, the specific geography of where she was last seen, and where now remains have reportedly been discovered. Each of these threads, investigators have indicated, requires revisiting in light of what has now been found. There is also the question of what the discovery means for people who may have been considered persons of interest over the years, and for the broader legal landscape of the case. No official conclusion has been reached. No public declaration of what the remains represent or confirm has been made at this stage. That caution is appropriate, Forensic work takes time. Accurate conclusions cannot be rushed without compromising the very integrity that makes them matter. But what the discovery has done, regardless of what the formal findings ultimately determine, is reanimate something. It has brought the case back into the active consciousness of people whose job it is to find the truth. It has placed new information into the right hands. And it has reminded the world one more time that Nancy Guthrie was a real person, not a cold case file gathering dust on a shelf, not a number in a database. A human being with a name and a face and a life that mattered, whose story deserves finally to be fully told. The psychological complexity of cases like this extends in every direction. It reaches into the lives of investigators who have carried it for years, into the families who have waited, who have marked birthdays and anniversaries and holidays with an empty space that never gets less empty, into communities that have wondered and speculated and grieved in the incomplete way you grieve when you don't have all the pieces. And it reaches into something larger, a question about how long the truth can stay buried before something shifts, before the ground gives way, before what was hidden finds its way finally back into the light. Whether that moment has arrived for Nancy Guthrie, no one can say with certainty yet, but something has changed. And in cases like this one, change, even complicated, painful, uncertain change, can be the first step toward what everyone has been waiting for: an answer, a name, a truth that holds. We talk about closure as though it is a destination, a place you eventually arrive at after the hardest parts of grief are behind you. But in cases like Nancy's, cases that have stretched across years without resolution, the people closest to the story often describe something far more complex than that. Something that doesn't fit neatly into the idea of an ending, because even when answers finally come, they arrive alongside new grief. The confirmation of what was feared carries its own weight. The full picture of what happened, once it is finally visible, has to be absorbed slowly over a long time by people who have already been carrying something heavy for years. What the recent development in this case represents is not, in any clean sense, a conclusion. It is a turning point, a shift in what investigators know and what they are now able to pursue. It is the opening of a new chapter in a story that has, for too long, been held in terrible suspension. Nancy Guthrie deserved better than the silence that followed her disappearance. She deserved the full force of every available resource, every possible question, every strand of evidence pursued to its natural end. Whether that happened, whether the systems that exist to find answers for people like her functioned as they should have throughout all these years, is something the renewed investigation may now help to clarify. There is something quietly powerful about the persistence of the people who refused to let this case go cold. The investigators who kept the file open when it would have been easier to close it. The advocates who kept speaking her name when everyone else had moved on. The family members who held both grief and hope in equal measure across years that must have felt at times endless. Whatever comes next in this investigation, that persistence has mattered more than most people will ever know. For the communities connected to this story, the discovery is a reminder of something that gets lost in the distance of news coverage and investigative narratives. Behind every name on a case file is a whole world, a world of mornings and habits and ordinary moments, a world of people who loved and were loved in return. A world that was interrupted, and that deserves at the very least the truth of what interrupted it. No official conclusion has been reached. The full implications of what has been found are still being carefully examined. The road to answers in a case this layered is rarely straight or fast, but the ground has shifted. And for those who have been waiting, for those who have held Nancy's name close, in whatever form their remembering has taken, that shift carries the fragile, real weight of something that has been a long time coming. The story is not finished, but it is moving again. Cases like Nancy Guthrie's stay alive because people like you refuse to look away. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people who disappear without answers, or the families who carry that weight across years, take a moment and leave a comment below. Share what you feel. Subscribe if you want to stay with stories that deserve to be told carefully and fully. And if you know someone who follows cases like this one, pass it along. The least we can do for the people at the center of these stories is to keep remembering them. This is how we do that.